The rain came down steady and cold as Emily Carter parked her car in front of the small bookstore on Maple Street. The windshield wipers moved back and forth, but she barely noticed. Her heart was beating faster than it should for a simple visit. She had told herself this trip was about business, okay, that she was only passing through town. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. She had come back because of him. The street looked almost the same as it had 8 years ago. The coffee shop on the corner still had its green awning. The old theater still had the cracked sign that read, "Coming soon." Only the bookstore looked slightly older, its paint faded and windows misted from the warmth inside. Through the glass, she saw Daniel Hayes, the man who once taught her about literature, about patience, and perhaps without meaning to, about love. Daniel was arranging books on the front shelf, moving carefully like every detail mattered. That was always his way. Even back then, when she was a young college student working part-time at his store, he had that same quiet focus. He never rushed anything, not his work, not his words, not his feelings. Watching him now, Emily felt time fold in on itself. The years she spent trying to forget this place suddenly seemed small compared to the pull she felt standing there again. She took a deep breath, opened the door, and a soft chime broke the stillness inside. The smell of books and faint vanilla candle drifted toward her, the same scent she used to love. Daniel looked up from his work, and his eyes met hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt heavy with all the things they had never said. "Emily," he said finally, his voice calm but uncertain. She smiled nervously. "Hi, Daniel. It's been a while." He stood still, surprise flickering across his face before it softened into something gentler. 8 years, he said quietly. "You still remember this place?" "I could never forget it," she replied. He motioned toward the shelves. "Well, not much has changed, except maybe the dust." She laughed softly, and the sound seemed to break the tension. They stood there for a second too long, both unsure how to bridge the gap of years between them. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "You look different, grown, but somehow the same." "Life does that," she said simply. "You look the same too. Maybe a few more lines around the eyes." He smiled at that, a small, real smile that reached his eyes. "Occupational hazard," he joked. Emily walked around the store, her fingers brushing over the book spines. She remembered every corner where she used to sit and read during lunch breaks, where Daniel would leave little notes with book quotes for her to find. Back then, he was her teacher in more ways than one. He taught her about literature, yes, but also about kindness, patience, and finding meaning in small things. When she left for Chicago after graduation, she told herself it was just time to move forward. But moving forward didn't mean moving on. The city gave her success, friends, and comfort, but never peace. Sometimes, when nights were too quiet, she'd catch herself wondering what Daniel was doing, if he ever thought of her. The bookstore still stood now she was here again, unsure of what she wanted to say. Maybe she wanted to see if the connection she once felt was still real. Maybe she wanted closure. Or maybe she just wanted to see him, the man who had unknowingly taught her how to feel something real. Daniel broke the silence. "So, what brings you back?" "Visiting family." Emily hesitated. "No, I just wanted to see the town again, and this place." He nodded slowly. "I'm glad you did." His tone was calm, but his eyes told another story. There was something there, curiosity, emotion, maybe even a touch of longing. He wasn't a man who showed feelings easily, but Emily had always been able to read him better than most. A low rumble of thunder rolled outside. The rain grew heavier, streaking down the windows in silver lines. Daniel looked toward the door. "Seems like the storm's not stopping anytime soon. You should stay a while." "I'll make some tea," she smiled, relieved for a reason to stay. "That would be nice." He disappeared into the back room, and Emily looked around the store once more. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman who had lived, worked, succeeded, but somewhere inside, she still looked like that girl who used to dream between these walls. When Daniel returned with 2 cups of tea, she took one and held it close for warmth. "Still remember how I like it?" she said after a sip. "Of course," he replied. Some things don't change. They sat near the window, the rain tapping softly against the glass. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind that comes when two people don't need to fill the air with words. But beneath that quiet, memories stirred. Finally, Daniel spoke. I used to think about the day you left. I didn't say much back then, but I was proud of you. I just didn't know how to tell you. Emily's throat tightened. I didn't think you noticed. I noticed everything, he said softly. You were always meant for something bigger. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for signs of the man she once admired so deeply. He was older now, maybe a little tired, but the kindness in his expression was the same. That kindness had once given her courage, and it was doing it again now. Do you ever regret staying here? She asked. He thought for a moment. Sometimes. But then I remember why I stayed. This store is part of who I am. It's where I've spent most of my life and where I met people who changed it. She knew he meant her. Though he didn't say it directly, the lights flickered from the storm outside, and the sound of rain grew louder, surrounding them in a cocoon of warmth and memory. Emily felt her heartbeat slow, matching the rhythm of the rain, for years. She'd been chasing something, a feeling, a certainty, a sense of belonging. Sitting here now, she realized maybe she had already found it once before. Right here in this small bookstore. Beside the man who once taught her what quiet love looked like, when she finally stood to leave. The rain had softened, but her heart was heavier. She turned to him at the door. Thank you for the tea, Daniel. He nodded, his voice gentle. You're always welcome here, Emily. As she stepped outside, the bell above the door chimed softly behind her. The street was quiet, the storm fading. She looked back once more through the window. Daniel was standing where she had left him, watching her go. His expression unreadable, but full of something deep. Maybe hope, maybe sadness, maybe both. Emily walked away slowly, her shoes splashing in the puddles, the rain cool against her face. She didn't know if she'd come back again tomorrow, but something inside her told her this wasn't the end. Some doors once opened again are never really meant to close. And somewhere behind her, the lights of the bookstore glowed softly, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet and shining under the pale light. Emily hadn't planned to go back to the bookstore so soon, but her heart wouldn't let her stay away. She told herself she just wanted to buy a book for her drive home, but deep down she knew it wasn't about the book. It was about Daniel, the man who once taught her how to see the beauty in quiet moments. When she walked into the store again, Daniel looked up from the counter, a bit surprised but clearly pleased. Back already? He asked, trying not to smile too much. She shrugged lightly. I forgot how much I missed this place. He handed her a cloth. Well, in that case, you can help me dust. I remember you were good at it. Emily laughed and took the cloth. I see you haven't changed your management style. Some habits are hard to break, he said with a playful tone. But there was warmth in his voice, the same warmth that once made her feel seen when she was younger and unsure of herself. They worked side by side, the way they used 2 years ago. She organized the books by author, and he corrected her order, a familiar rhythm that made the air feel lighter. Every movement, every small conversation brought back memories she thought she had locked away. You still remember how I liked the books arranged, he said. Glancing at her, I remember a lot of things you taught me, she replied. Not just about books. Daniel looked at her, his eyes softening. You always learned faster than I could teach. Emily smiled faintly. You were patient. I needed that back then. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with quiet emotion. The kind that only comes when two people share a history they both still feel but don't fully talk about. Daniel broke the stillness as he reached for a box of new arrivals. I never asked what made you leave the city. She thought for a moment. Maybe I just got tired of running toward things that never felt real. I built a life there. Good job, friends, but something was always missing. I guess I came back to see if it was still here. Didn't say anything right away. Then, softly, he said, sometimes the things we miss most are the ones we thought we outgrew. His words hit deeper than he realized. Emily looked down at the stack of books in her hands, trying to steady her breathing. For a moment, she wished she could go back, not to her younger self, but to the simplicity of what they once had. As the afternoon passed, Daniel made them coffee, and they sat near the same corner table where they used to talk after closing hours. She remembered those nights, her asking questions about authors, about meaning, about how people could write about love without saying it directly. Daniel had always told her that the best stories were the ones that said everything in silence. Now, sitting across from him again, she understood what he meant. He looked out the window for a long moment before speaking. "When you left, the store felt too quiet. I kept expecting to hear your voice every time the doorbell rang." She felt her heart twist. "Why didn't you write to me?" He met her eyes. "I thought you had your own life to build. I didn't want to hold you back. You were meant for bigger places." "But maybe I didn't want bigger places," she said softly. "Maybe I just wanted something that felt right." Daniel's expression shifted, the kind of look that carried years of unspoken thoughts. "Maybe I made the mistake of thinking letting you go was the kindest thing I could do." Emily didn't know what to say. She just stared at him, realizing how much time had passed and how much they'd both carried alone. Outside, the clouds thickened again and thunder rolled faintly in the distance. The sound filled the quiet space between them. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly. Daniel smiled faintly. "I thought about it once or twice. But this store, it became my world. Maybe I was waiting for something or someone." Her heart skipped. "And did they ever come back?" He looked at her, his voice low. "Seems like she just did." Emily froze. The words hung in the air, soft but heavy. She didn't know how to respond. Her pulse quickened, and for a brief second she wanted to reach for his hand. But she didn't. She wasn't sure if it was too soon or too late. The lights flickered from the storm outside. Daniel stood up and went to check the windows, and she followed. Together, they secured the glass, their hands brushing slightly. It was a small touch, but it sent a rush of old memories flooding back. The laughter, the long talks, the closeness they once shared but never named. When the thunder grew louder, Emily sat down again. "Do you still host poetry nights?" she asked. He nodded. "Not as often. People stop showing up after a while. Maybe they just need a reason to start again," she said. He looked at her with a small, knowing smile. "Maybe you're that reason." Something in her chest shifted, a mix of hope and ache. For years, she believed the past was just a memory. But sitting there, watching Daniel move around the store, she realized it wasn't the past calling her back. It was the unfinished story between them. As the rain began again, Daniel placed an old poetry book in front of her. "You used to love this one," he said. She opened it and smiled at the underlined line inside, one she remembered marking years ago. "Sometimes the heart remembers what the mind tries to forget." Emily looked up, her eyes glistening. "You kept this." "I kept everything that reminded me of you," he said quietly. The honesty in his voice shook her. The storm outside seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of them, two people who had once been too careful with their hearts. As the day turned to evening, the store grew dim. Daniel lit a small lamp near their table. Its warm glow cast soft shadows, and for a moment, the years between them disappeared. Emily leaned back, taking in the sight of the man who had once been her teacher, her quiet friend, and maybe something more. "You know," she said gently, "I came back thinking everything would feel smaller, but it doesn't. It feels like it's been waiting." Daniel's eyes softened. "Some places hold on to memories until you're ready to find them again." The clock on the wall ticked slowly, the storm easing into silence. She could have stayed there forever, surrounded by the comfort of old books and the presence of the man who had shaped so much of who she became. When she finally stood to leave, Daniel walked her to the door. "Will you come by tomorrow?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Emily smiled. "Maybe, if you promise not to make me dust again." He laughed softly. "No promises." She stepped out into the damp evening air. The rain had stopped again, and the smell of wet pavement filled the air. As she walked away, she felt lighter, but her heart knew this wasn't over. Something had reopened between them, something fragile but real. And as she glanced back one last time, Daniel was still standing by the window, watching her go. His reflection blurred against the light, like a man who had been waiting for the right chapter to begin again. The next day, sunlight spilled across Maple Street for the first time in days. The storm had passed, leaving the air cool and fresh. Emily stood at the edge of the bookstore again, holding a cup of coffee she didn't really want. She had told herself she wasn't going back, that she needed to move on and finish her trip. But something kept pulling her toward that small wooden door. When she stepped inside, Daniel was already there, sorting through a new stack of books. He looked up, smiled softly, and said, "I was starting to think you'd changed your mind. About visiting." She asked, pretending to sound casual, about staying. He said, meeting her eyes. Emily didn't reply. She set her coffee on the counter and helped him unpack the books. It felt natural, like no time had passed at all. They worked quietly, both aware that silence could sometimes say more than words. After a while, Daniel said, "You always used to organize the poetry section first. Guess some things never change." She smiled faintly. "And you always used to watch me do it, pretending to work." He laughed, a quiet sound that filled the empty space around them. "I didn't think you noticed." "I noticed," she said, her voice soft but steady. Their eyes met briefly before they both turned back to the books. The air between them carried a mix of comfort and tension, the kind that comes when two people still feel something they haven't named. As the hours passed, the day grew warmer. Daniel closed the blinds halfway to block the sunlight. "How long are you planning to stay in town?" he asked. "I don't know," Emily admitted. "I thought just a few days. But now I'm not so sure." He nodded slowly. "It's good to see you take your time with something. You always used to rush toward the next thing." She glanced at him. "Maybe that's because I was running from something too." Their eyes met again, and neither looked away this time. Daniel's expression was thoughtful, the way it always had been when he was about to say something that mattered. "You don't have to keep running, Emily. Not here." The words stayed with her. She turned away, pretending to rearrange a display, but her heart was racing. She wanted to say something to tell him how often she had thought of him, how the sound of his voice still echoed in her memory. But she couldn't find the courage. Instead, she asked, "Do you ever regret staying?" He paused. "Sometimes. But if I'd left, I would have missed moments like this." The answer was simple, but it hit her deeply. She realized that for him, the small things, a quiet room, a shared look, a conversation, were everything. He had always been that way, steady and sure. While she had been restless and searching, by afternoon, the bookstore was quiet again. Emily sat on the old wooden chair near the corner, flipping through a worn notebook she found under the counter. "Is this yours?" she asked. Daniel looked over and smiled. "That old thing? It's full of my terrible poetry. You don't want to read that?" She opened it anyway, her eyes catching on a page written in faded ink. Her breath caught as she read a few lines. "Some people leave, and the world feels smaller. Some return, and it feels whole again." She looked up at him. "You wrote this after I left, didn't you?" Daniel hesitated before nodding. It was easier to write than to say it. Emily closed the notebook carefully. "You should have told me." "I wanted to," he said quietly, "but I thought it wasn't my place. You had your life waiting for you." She shook her head. "I had a life, yes, but not the one that made me happy." There it was, the truth she'd been holding back. The words hung in the air like a fragile thread, waiting for him to catch them. He leaned against the counter, looking at her with quiet understanding. Sometimes happiness takes time to find its way back. Their eyes met again, and this time the silence felt heavier, filled with years of missed chances and what-ifs. The bell above the door suddenly rang, breaking the moment. A customer walked in, a young woman holding a list of books for a school project. Daniel greeted her with his usual warmth, while Emily stepped aside, pretending to browse the shelves. She watched him talk to the customer, saw how kind and patient he was, just like he had always been. That steadiness, that calm, it was what had drawn her to him in the first place. It wasn't a love that burned fast, but one that lingered. Lasting quietly over time, when the customer left, Daniel turned to find Emily watching him. "What?" he asked, smiling. "Nothing," she said, shaking her head. "Just thinking how some people never really change. Is that a good thing?" he asked. "For you." "Yes," she said softly. "For me. Maybe it's time I stopped trying to." He studied her face, and something unspoken passed between them again. Something fragile but real. It was getting late. The sun dipped low, spilling golden light through the blinds. Emily gathered her things, but Daniel stopped her at the door. "Emily," he said quietly, "don't disappear this time." His voice was steady, but his eyes gave him away. There was fear there. "Huh?" She hesitated, her hand on the door handle. "I don't plan to," she said. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The air between them was full of everything they hadn't said. The apologies, the longing, the quiet affection that had never truly left. When she finally walked outside, the evening air was cool. The sky was painted in pink and gold, the kind of sunset that made the whole town glow. Emily stood on the sidewalk, breathing deeply, trying to calm the rush of emotions in her chest. She didn't know what came next, but she knew something inside her had shifted. Seeing Daniel again had reminded her of who she used to be: hopeful, curious, alive. And for the first time in years, she wanted to stay somewhere not because she had to, but because it felt right inside the store. Daniel watched her through the window, his reflection blending with the light. There was a quiet smile on his face, the kind that came from relief more than joy. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he wanted to see her again. As Emily walked down the street, the last of the sunlight fading behind her, she thought of the notebook she had read, the words he had written all those years ago. Some people leave, and the world feels smaller. Maybe, she thought, some people come back so the world can finally feel whole again. The wind carried the scent of rain and old books behind her, and she knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the pause before everything changed. A week had passed since Emily decided to stay in town. What was supposed to be a short visit had quietly turned into something more. Each morning she found herself walking toward Daniel's bookstore as if her heart knew the way before her mind could decide. What began as a visit had turned into a rhythm: coffee in the morning, shared work through the afternoon, quiet talks in the evening. The store, once silent and worn, was slowly coming alive again. And so was something inside both of them. That day, sunlight streamed through the windows, landing on the wooden shelves that now gleamed with fresh polish. Emily stood on a ladder, carefully hanging a new sign Daniel had made: "Poetry night this Friday." He was setting up a small table near the back, arranging chairs, his hand steady but his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said, glancing up at her, "when I started this place, I never imagined it would feel this alive again." She smiled down at him. "Maybe it just needed a little help. Or maybe," he said quietly, "it just needed you." Her heart skipped, but she didn't reply. Instead, she focused on adjusting the sign, pretending she didn't hear the emotion in his voice. But she did. Every word lingered in her chest like the soft echo of a song she never stopped knowing. When the work was done, they sat by the window with tea, watching the sunlight fade into gold. Outside, the town moved slowly. People walking dogs, cars passing, children laughing. Inside, it was calm, the kind of calm that felt safe. Daniel leaned back, his eyes on the fading sky. "You remember the first time you came here?" Emily nodded. "Of course. I was so nervous I almost didn't come in." "You looked terrified," he said, chuckling. "You stood outside for 10 minutes before opening the door." She laughed softly. "You watched me the whole time, didn't you?" "I did," he admitted. "And when you finally came in, I thought, this girl's going to change my life somehow. I just didn't know how yet." His words caught her off guard. She stared at him, unsure what to say. Over the past week, she had seen a side of him she'd only glimpsed years ago, still quiet, still thoughtful, but more open, more vulnerable. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Because back then, you had the whole world ahead of you. I didn't want to be the reason you stayed." She looked down, tracing the rim of her cup. "Maybe you would have been the reason I came back sooner." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full of all the emotions that had been waiting for years to surface. The bookstore seemed to hold its breath, as if the walls themselves understood the importance of this moment. When poetry night finally came, the store buzzed with quiet energy. The soft hum of voices, the shuffle of chairs, the smell of coffee and old pages, everything felt warm and alive. Daniel introduced the event, his voice calm but proud. "It's been a while since we've done this," he said to the small crowd, "but some things are worth bringing back." Emily watched from the corner, her heart full. He looked confident, yet his eyes often found hers in the crowd. As if to remind himself she was really there, when it was her turn to read, she hesitated. She hadn't planned to, but Daniel handed her a paper and whispered, "This one's for you." She unfolded it, and her breath caught. It was the poem from his notebook, the one he had written after she left. She looked at him, unsure, but he nodded. So she began to read. "Some people leave, and the world grows smaller. Some return, and the air remembers their name. Time folds quietly between their footsteps, and suddenly home feels possible again." Her voice trembled at first, but by the end, the words flowed with calm certainty. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment before soft applause filled the air. Daniel smiled, his eyes shining. She smiled back, and in that instant she realized she wasn't just reading his words. She was living them. After everyone left and the store grew quiet again, they stayed behind to clean up. The air was thick with leftover laughter and the faint scent of coffee. Daniel picked up a chair, then looked at her. "You were amazing tonight," he said. "Those were your words," she replied. "They became yours when you spoke them." They stood facing each other, the room dim except for the glow of the lamp on the counter. The quiet stretched between them, deep and unbroken. Emily stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You always knew what to say." Daniel smiled softly. "Maybe because you always listened." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not just the man from her past, but the one who had quietly waited, believing she'd find her way back. "I used to think leaving was the brave thing," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I think coming back was—" T took a slow breath. "And I'm glad you did." The words were simple, but the way he said them carried years of emotion. She could see it in his eyes, the gratitude, the affection, quiet love that had never faded. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft and steady against the windows. It felt almost like the first day she had returned. Only this time, the air was lighter, and the weight between them was gone. Daniel reached for something on the counter and handed it to her. It was a small hardcover book wrapped with a ribbon. She untied it, and inside the first page was a short note in his handwriting. "You came back. Everything feels like it makes sense again." Her throat tightened as she looked up at him. "You still write things like that?" "Only when I mean them," he said. Emily closed the book and held it to her chest. "You taught me so many things, Daniel, about words, about patience, about love, even when you didn't say it out loud." He smiled softly. "And you taught me that some good things don't end. They just wait." She stepped closer, the distance between them finally disappearing. The sound of rain filled the silence as they stood there. To people who had once walked separate paths, now standing in the same place again, older, steadier, and finally ready for a long moment. They just looked at each other. No grand gestures, no dramatic words, only the quiet certainty at what they felt had never truly gone away. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but sure. "I think I'm home now." Daniel's eyes softened, and he nodded slowly. "Then stay," he whispered. Outside, the rain kept falling, soft, calm, endless. Inside, the light from the bookstore windows glowed against the dark street, steady and warm, Emily smiled through her tears. She had spent years chasing a life that never quite fit, but now, standing beside the man who once taught her how to see beauty in simplicity, she finally understood what it meant to belong. Sometimes, life doesn't take you back to the beginning, it brings you back to the place you were always meant to return to. And for Emily, that place was here in the quiet heart of a small bookstore, beside the man who taught her how to feel again.